Hey guys, in today's video we're going to be talking about trauma and self-harm. So self-harm is something that I feel like is pretty widely misunderstood. A common belief about self-harm is that it's done as a suicide attempt. However, most of the time this isn't true. A lot of self-harm is done as self-soothing or even a survival mechanism instead of a suicide attempt. So that's something that I think is not pretty understood, and we're going to get into a little bit more of that today. So this video is going to be focused mostly on self-harm and how it relates to trauma. So there are people that self-harm that haven't experienced trauma, so this isn't the case for every single person, and this video isn't saying that this is the only kind of people that can self-harm, but that's what I'm going to choose to focus on because that's something that I have a lot of experience with. And also a lot of the information that I'm going to be going over today is going to be from this book, Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. And I highly, highly recommend this book if you're interested in learning more about trauma and trauma responses and how trauma affects people. This book is great and has a ton of really good information, and I'm going to be referencing a little bit of that information today. So before we get into the video, I do want to give a trigger warning. We are going to be talking about self-harm in this video, and I am actually going to be mentioning a couple different specific methods. I'm not going to go into, extreme detail about these things, but methods are something that are going to come up in this video. So if that is something that you would find triggering, maybe this video is not the one to watch. But if you're interested in learning more, I hope you stick around and watch the rest of the video. So first off, we're going to start with what is self-harm. I think what people think of most commonly when you hear self-harm is cutting, but self-harm is really just anything that is done to intentionally harm yourself. So there are things like cutting, burning, even a lot of eating disorder behaviors like binging and purging. Those are things that can be considered self-harm because they're done to intentionally harm your body. So there are many, many different things that fall under the category of self-harm. And there are also, like I kind of mentioned before, a lot of reasons that someone might engage in self-harm, but we're going to focus in this video on how self-harm is used as a soothing technique as a result of trauma. And I also want to give a quick little disclaimer that just because I'm talking about self-harm and how it does help to self-soothe, I am not saying that it is an effective thing to do. This video is not intended to think that self-harm is good. I'm not intending to endorse self-harm here. I'm simply just kind of saying what it does for people, why people do it, and then speak a little bit about my own experience. And I feel like when you can understand where the desire to self-harm comes from, then you can move towards finding something that is more healthy and more effective that's going to fill that need. All right, so what does trauma have to do with self-harm? So pretty much universally, when someone has experienced chronic abuse, they are also going to experience pretty major disruptions in their emotional states. It's really common for people who were abused in childhood to develop anxiety and depression that then persists into adulthood, even if they are not in the abusive situation anymore. So trauma causes pretty intense states of fear, depression, hopelessness, and often dissociation. And dissociation is kind of this feeling of being completely disconnected from everything around them. And a lot of the times with people who are abused, dissociation can be used as a protective mechanism so that way you are not experiencing the abuse as intensely. However, it can also cause intense feelings of dysphoria that are extremely painful and extremely difficult to deal with. So what has been kind of observed is that people who have experienced chronic abuse, especially early in childhood, will develop ways to help reduce the intensity of these emotional states. And one of the things that people will do is they will self-harm as a way to kind of reduce the intensity and to regulate their emotional states a little bit. All right, so next is to talk a little bit about why self-harm is used in these situations. So the emotional states that are caused by trauma are really, really difficult to break out of. Something that is a very dramatic shock to your body is what's going to cause a break in the intense emotional states like dissociation that we discussed before. So if someone is feeling very disconnected from themselves, from everything around them, self-harm can be used to kind of pull yourself out of that disconnect. The most common way that this is talked about is through cutting, because when you're in a state of dissociation and disconnect, self-harm, at a certain point, the pain that the cutting would bring helps to pull your body out of that state of dissociation. So the pain eventually causes a calm relief feeling, and it becomes a survival technique because the emotional pain is a lot more difficult to deal with than the physical pain. So the reason that a lot of, trauma survivors turn to self-harm is because the emotional pain is so great. When you translate it into something like physical pain, it kind of calms your system down and gives you something that is a lot easier to navigate and understand than emotional pain is. So now I just want to talk a little bit about my experience with this. I started self-harming around the age of 12, and it is something that I still struggle with today. I am working very hard to not do it anymore. However, it's been something that I have used for so many years in my life that it's pretty hard to break away from. So it's kind of a constant struggle with how I can deal with this and work towards doing things that are not self-harm in order to help me. I feel like I've experienced self-harm and used it in two main ways. So the first way that I've used it is when I'm very emotionally overwhelmed. So this would be like when I am very afraid or very angry or very sad, like when my emotions just feel so big and so overwhelming that I feel like I need some sort of physical release for them. And I think this originated a lot in childhood, where I kind of lived in a constant state of fear. So I was always afraid. I was always very highly emotionally aroused. And so something like self-harm lowered that level of intensity for me. So when I felt like my emotions were like super high and super difficult to deal with and very overwhelming, I would turn to self-harm to help calm me down. And then the second way that I've really used self-harm is when I feel very emotionally numb or dissociative. So this is kind of the opposite of me being overly emotional and feeling very overwhelmed by my emotions. This is when I feel like I don't have emotions and I feel really disconnected, or I feel like I'm not real, or I feel like just, things around me are so far removed from myself. And it's a really weird feeling, because it's similar to the feeling of being emotionally overwhelmed, but it's kind of an overwhelm due to a lack of emotion. So I feel extremely numb and I feel very separate from my body. And so I feel like the way that I can make this situation go away is by using self-harm as a kind of shock to my body to put myself back in it and kind of lower the overall level of dissociation. So it helps in those situations, which is very frustrating because it's something that is not effective. There's a lot of the reasons that people shouldn't self-harm, I think, are pretty well known, but there's a lot of complications. There's, high risk of infection. There is the high risk of accidentally killing yourself if you're not being careful enough. So even though it is something that does help self-soothe, it is not really that effective because it carries so much risks with it. So things that I have found to do instead of self-harm are still things that I feel like are going to shock my body. So I do things like putting an ice pack on my face or putting an ice pack on the insides of my wrists. Or sometimes if there's a specific area that I feel like this is where I want to self-harm, I will put the ice pack there. So I'm still getting kind of this intense, a little bit painful feeling, but it's not causing any permanent damage and it's not particularly dangerous. The other thing in a similar vein to that is I will take a cold shower. Oftentimes I will kind of alternate between hot and cold showers, and that helps to shock my body even more because I'm kind of switching between the temperatures. And that's another way to help bring down that level of intense, emotional arousal. And then another similar thing is to eat something really sour. So I use warheads or lemon juice, and I don't think works quite as well for me as the ice packs or the showers, but it is a similar feeling. And if I'm out somewhere where I, don't have access to an ice pack, I can use like a warhead candy instead, and that'll help a little bit still. So that is it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. And again, A lot of this information is from Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. I did a very brief overview of a pretty long section about self-harm. So if you're interested in learning more, I do highly recommend that book because I cannot explain it nearly as well as she does in that book. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave those in the comments. I love to read what you guys think about what I'm saying, and I would love to answer any questions that people have. And thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.